We have this vision of what could and should be, and we start equating our own personal success and our own personal fulfillment with the blessing of God. And we capture it in moments, right? I brought some picture frames with me, and we try to frame up our life. We try to frame up our picture of what we think life is going to be, and we're going to have this certain kind of house, and we're going to have this many kids, and we're going to work in this kind of job, and we're going to experience this kind of career, and we're going to go on these type of vacations. And all of the picture frames are filled in, and everyone's smiling, and everybody's happy, and everybody's fulfilled, and everybody seems like they have it all together in the picture frames in our mind. Then life happens. Then the bottom falls out. Then the economy tanks. Then your boss says that he doesn't need you anymore. Then your wife says she doesn't need you anymore. Then your kids stop returning your texts or your calls. And all of a sudden we're left to figure out, what does the picture of our life look like? And I brought this picture frame. It was in our basement. It's not hanging up on the wall with all the perfect picture frames. It says family at the top, and there's a picture missing of a family. Like we're just sometime at some point in some move that we had, the picture fell out. And we didn't replace it, we just put it in the basement. And I think this more accurately describes life, doesn't it? It's got dust all over it. I mean, there are people smiling, except for Elijah. He's just got done crying, but he's trying to smile. And there's a picture missing. And as we've been in this series over the last few weeks called Flawesome, I think it's easy to look at Scripture and we see all the perfect pictures that we think God puts together because we have a retrospective view of them. But for the people that were experiencing the movement and the presence and the power of God, they didn't have that perspective. There were pictures missing. There was conflict that ensued. There was uncertainty that they faced. There was trials and heartache and loss. And that's one of the things I love about the Bible. People ask me all the time, how do I know that the Bible is real? It's not because God says it's real. It's not because God says it's true. I mean, that's important. But I think I have a confidence that the Bible is the inherent word of God because of all the messed up aspects of it. Because it's not perfect. Because it's not colored within the lines. Because it doesn't have a rhyme or reason at times. It's just jacked at times. And I think, that's my life. And I think if the Bible weren't real and the Bible weren't true, it would look perfect. And it would be put together. And all the dots would connect. Because it was somebody that wasn't living real life, writing a fantasy and a story that always has a happy ending. So if you have a Bible, turn to Esther chapter 4. If you don't, you can find all the message notes, as Jeremy said, on our app. And my name is Justin, I'm one of the pastors here. And I'm so glad that you guys are here today. If you're a guest, I'm grateful that you're here. We're going to look at a story today that I love. It's one of them. I think basically I've just shared some of my favorite stories throughout the Bible over the last few weeks. But I love the story of Esther because it's a story that if you're reading it, you think there's no way that this happened, right? Like it's not put together. It's not perfect. There's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of uncertainty. And it appears as though there's going to be an execution. It appears as though the story is not going to play out well. And then God is just kind of silent and absent in the whole story as well. So before we look at Esther chapter 4, I want to give you just a little background of what we're going to talk about this morning. This is a story that's set in the capital of Persia in a city called Susa. And there's a guy by the name of King Xerxes, and he's king at this time, and he's a guy of huge influence. He has a lot of power. He has a lot of notoriety, and he loves himself. Like he loves himself, some Xerxes, more than Kanye loves Kanye. And so the first chapter talks all about this guy's power and how amazing he was, and he likes to party. He likes throwing big parties. In fact, in chapter 1 of Esther, the book of Esther in the Old Testament, it talks about a 180-day party that this guy has. 6-month party. All right, like that's bigger than any Oscars, bigger than any Academy Award party. Like this guy parties for 6 months hard. He gets done partying for the 6-month party. He lets everybody go home. Then he has another party for 7 days, kind of to cool down. It's like a cool down party. It's just like when you're on the treadmill and you're running fast, running hard, you need a little cool down. So he has a little cool down party for 7 days, and he invites the entire city of Susa to this party. And all these people show up. And he gets hammered. He gets sloshed. He gets so drunk that he starts bragging to his buddies. He starts bragging to his buddies about how hot his wife is. And he starts telling them how beautiful she is. She's the most beautiful woman in all of Persia, and she loves him. And so they're like, well, prove it. Prove how hot she is. Why don't you bring her to the party? Because she's not at the party. And so he sends some servants to go get his wife, and she refuses to come. She says no. She stands him up, and she shows him up. And the king gets so mad. So he calls a cabinet meeting. He has all of his advisors come together. And this is like a national crisis, okay? Because he's never been turned down. He's never been denied. And all these guys come together, and they determine that if he doesn't do something about his wife and her refusal to come to this party, that he is going to be shown up, and no woman in the country of Persia will respect their husband anymore. And so he decides he's going to banish her, like exile her from the country. He's getting rid of her. So he gets rid of her, and a few days later he sobers up and he realizes that he does not have a queen. And that's a problem. A king without a queen is a problem. And so he's like, what should we do? And so he calls a cabinet meeting. These advisors come together and like, let's hold a beauty contest. So Xerxes oversaw 127 different provinces, like states, in the country of Persia. So they decide that they're going to bring together not the most academic, not the most organized, not the sweetest, not the kindest, not the most patient, not the woman with the highest business acumen. They're going to bring together the most beautiful women in all of Persia. So one from every province is going to be called to the palace, and they're going to compete to be the queen of Persia. Now, I know it sounds like a far-fetched idea that a society would ever be so superficial to have women come together to compete for the affection of a bachelor. I know that that's really hard to believe that anybody would ever do that, but it actually happened a long, long time ago, okay? We're much more sophisticated now. And so one of the women is this woman named Esther. Also, her name is also called Hadassah, but in this story, she's called Esther. And the Bible says that Esther has been raised by her cousin Mordecai, and she's Jewish. And so Mordecai says to Esther, hey, if you want to win this competition, if you want the best shot at winning and becoming queen of Persia, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. Don't tell anybody of your heritage, because Jews were hated by the Persians. But Esther is so beautiful, and she's so smart, and she's so sharp that nobody notices that she's Jewish just by looking at her. And Esther had this it factor. She had this influence with people. Everybody that met her liked her. People who didn't even know her were influenced by her. She was just that type of person. She has favor with people. And so she goes into this competition, and the Bible says that King Xerxes is more attracted to her than any other woman that's there. And so she becomes queen of Persia. And we think, man, what a beautiful story. What a perfect picture frame story. Let's close in prayer. But that's not how the story ends. That's how it begins. Esther's cousin Mordecai, who is Jewish, obviously, and who raised Esther, he sits at the city gate every single day. And as he sits at the city gate, there's this guy named Haman who's an assistant to the king that passes by the city gate, and he demands every day that Mordecai bow to him and worship him because he's Persian and Mordecai's Jewish. And Mordecai refuses to do it. Now, typically, a Jewish person couldn't get away with such disobedience, but years earlier, Mordecai had saved King Xerxes from an assassination attempt, so he has high favor with the king, but Haman hates him. And so Haman comes up with this plan because of Mordecai's refusal to bow to him and worship him, that he's going to get King Xerxes to extinguish all the Jews in Persia. So he comes up with this plan, and the king goes along with it because he doesn't know that his wife is Jewish. Mordecai finds out about this plan. He moves from the city gate to the temple gate, tears his clothes, and starts mourning. And Esther, Mordecai's cousin, comes by city gate, or by the palace gate, sees Mordecai in mourning and doesn't know what's going on. So that's where we're going to pick up the story. In Esther chapter 4, verse 5, it says this: Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and all the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: Do not think that because you're the king in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and neither will my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So I just want to do, with the time we have left this morning, I just want to talk about 4 observations that make this story flawsome and that allow us to glean some principles for our life that will allow God, an awesome God, to use flawed people like you and I. And the first is this: God leverages every aspect of our story for flawsome things. If you go back 2 chapters in Esther chapter 2, it says this in verse 7. It says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she neither had a father or mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her in to be his daughter when her mother and father had died. Yesterday, Friday and Saturday, Trish and I were in Dallas at this church speaking. We're doing a marriage conference for this church, and we have this part of one of our sessions where we talk about how I'm a hypochondriac and I make up diseases that don't exist and think I'm dying from them. And it's funny, except if you're me. And then people just laugh at you over and over again. And so she's talking about, she's telling this story about us being in the airport and me like wearing out a hand sanitizer station and actually rubbing it in my nostrils, because this will change some of your life. It'll actually sanitize the air that you're breathing in your nostrils if you do that. So anyway, so we're talking about that, and she mentions this story. She mentions this fact. She's like, a few years ago when the Ebola crisis came out, Justin thought he was going to die from Ebola. And then I pipe up and say, I was tracking it online. I knew where every case of Ebola was in 2014. So we get done with the session. We walk off the stage. There's like this group of people waiting to talk to us down at the bottom of the stage, the foot of the stage, and they're just smiling. And I'm like, what is going on? They're like, the guy in the United States who had Ebola, he's here this weekend. I'm like, what? I'm like, what are the odds of that? And then I started thinking, well, it's 1 in about 700 million. That's what the odds are of the one guy in the United States that had Ebola and survived, that he's here at this marriage conference that we're doing. And so about 45 people told me that, like over and over and over again, because apparently he's pretty famous in Texas and I guess around the world. But anyway, he was a doctor that was serving in Liberia and treating Ebola patients and contracted Ebola. So he was flown from Dallas to Atlanta to the CDC, was quarantined for 19 days, and, not for 19 days. 19 different doctors treated him while he was quarantined, and he survived, which I didn't know you could survive Ebola, but he did. So that was on Friday night. Saturday morning, we're sitting back in the green room, kind of waiting to do the first session Saturday morning, and a group of people walk in, and they're all smiling. And they're like, hey, how you doing? You remember the guy you made fun of that had Ebola? This is him, right? And so they introduce us to him. His name was Dr. Brantley, and he's laughing. He's kind. We take a picture together. I hug him. I'm not dead yet. All right, my ears feel a little hot this morning, but I'm going to be fine, okay? And so anyway, so we're kind of laughing about this, and Trisha says to him, she says, what's different about you now than before you had Ebola? And he said, the biggest difference is I have a higher level of empathy for my patients than I ever had before. He said, especially my terminally ill ones, because he thought he was going to die. He should have died. And I just thought, it's interesting how God can take some of the dire circumstances of our life, some of the most dreadful and some of the most painful parts of our story, and he can use them to impact other people. It was this reminder that no matter how bad our circumstances, no matter how rough our story is, God can use every aspect of our story for his good. Esther's an orphan. She has no mom or dad. Her parents were killed. We don't know how. Maybe it was in the evacuation or the overthrowing of Israel. Her mom and dad have died. She's experienced tragedy. She's experienced abandonment. She's been orphaned. She's been adopted into a home of her cousin. Her family has been exiled. They're now living in Persia, not in Israel. She's a refugee. She's brought to Persia to be a sex object for a self-centered king who loves himself and loves power. He doesn't worship her God. He doesn't share her values. And she finds herself in a position where only she has any leverage at all to save Israel. And it only comes through the risking of her own life. And it's not even a guarantee. The nation of Israel's story isn't much different, right? They're God's people. They're the chosen people of God. They've been saved from slavery. They've been rescued from Pharaoh. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've crossed the Jordan River. They've seen all these miracles. Man has rained down from heaven. God has shown up in miraculous ways. And they can't maintain their focus on him long enough to even have him bless them. And so they keep getting conquered by kingdom after kingdom after kingdom. And now they're scattered all over the place. They have no hope. They have no leader. And Esther is their only hope of sparing being annihilated by the Persian king. That's all they have left. Mordecai, he sits at the palace gate every single day, refusing to bow his knee to a foreign leader. Standing up for what he believes, standing up for what is right, worshiping God and God alone. And what is his thanks for that? The person who he refuses to worship is so incensed by it, they come up with a plan to annihilate the Jewish people. I mean, have you ever been there, ever felt like you were being faithful, you're doing what is right, and you're choosing what is good, and the picture frame of your life is not playing out like you thought it would, or like you thought it should? Dr. Brantley was serving people who had Ebola in Liberia, and he gets Ebola. Is that fair? Is that right? Come on. Where is God in that? How can God use that? How can God use your financial mess? How can God work in your divorce? How can God work in the failure of a friendship? How can God work in the loss of a job? See, when we doubt God's sovereignty, we allow our circumstances to define the effectiveness of our faith. And so we try to take control. We try to do what we think is right, and we cease allowing God to be God. And the story of Esther is a reminder that God is at work in every aspect of your story. The good parts, the tragic parts, the abandoned parts, the silent parts. The second observation is faith in God doesn't always lead to obedience, but obedience to God will always lead to greater faith. I want you to process that statement for just a second, because some of you don't think it's true. Faith in God will not always lead you to obedience, but obedience to God will always deepen your faith. Look at Esther 4, verse 14. This is Mordecai talking to Esther. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family, you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you may come into a royal position for such a time as this? You know what's interesting about the book of Esther? God is not mentioned one time. Yahweh, God, Lord, not mentioned one time. It's the only book in the Bible where God's name is not mentioned at all. There's no miracle in the book of Esther. There's no supernatural presence of God in the book of Esther. God does not show up one time to our knowledge in the book of Esther. He does not speak audibly. He does not show up with a pillar of fire by day like he did for the Israelites, or a cloud of fire by day and a pillar by, what, you know what I'm saying? Cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. Bear with me. You wouldn't even know the difference anyway, okay? So don't laugh at me. God doesn't show up at all in the book of Esther. He's completely silent. There's no vision. There's no dream. An angel does not visit anyone. And I think for many of us, we're waiting for our faith to increase before we obey. But if we're really honest, the strength of our faith does not cause us to obey at all. You know why? You know how I know this? Because for some of us, we equate faith with obedience. But for some of us, we believe that God owns everything and that we're called to give back to him, but some of us still don't give, even though that's what we believe, even though we have faith that God is the provider, even though we say that one of our core beliefs is God owns everything and God's going to provide for my needs, and God says, hey, would you give back to me of an overflow of my relationship with you? We believe that to be true, but we don't obey. We believe the verse where God says, hey, forgive as I have forgiven you. We believe that we're called to forgive. We believe, we have faith in the practice and the process and the power of forgiveness, but we still hold grudges, right? Just because you believe something doesn't mean that you actually obey it. We believe that verse, we have faith in that verse that says, hey, do not worry about anything, but by prayer and petition, offer your requests to me. Don't be anxious, and yet we worry more than we pray, right? Just because you have faith in something doesn't mean that you're obedient to it. It's not faith that leads to obedience, but it's obedience that leads to a greater faith. And if we want to do something flawesome for God, if we want God to use our flawed lives in an awesome way, it starts by saying yes to the things that we already believe. It starts by obeying God to the level of our knowledge of him. Like we already know all that we need to know pretty much about God to live for him. We just don't do what he says we should do. And I've learned in my life that partial obedience is really just disobedience. And can I say that you have no idea how much your yes might mean? You have no idea. Mordecai says, if you remain silent, relief and deliverance will come from another place. What is he saying? He's saying the opportunity of a lifetime must be seized within the lifetime of that opportunity. Like there's a finite life that you have. Yes, you're going to live on for all eternity, but you have a certain window of time to make a difference. And your obedience is what propels you. Your obedience is what fuels God to partner with you to make a difference in this world. He says, Esther, if you don't risk it all, then deliverance will come from someone else. And this is a reminder to me that God does not need me, he chooses me. God does not need us, he chooses us. He chooses us to be partners with him. People ask Trish and I all the time, why would you start Hope City in your 40s? Move back to Indianapolis, start a church. You know what the compelling reason was? I have about 20 to 25 years of great ministry left, and I want to pour out my life within the window of this opportunity to help as many people in this city find hope in a God that loves them. And if we don't do it as Hope City Church, somebody else will. Now, that's not a competition. I don't want to miss out on the opportunity that God has set aside for us. It's why we're so passionate about meeting here on Sunday and gathering, and why we transform this banquet hall into a place of worship. It's not for a show, and it's not to impress people. It's to leverage our gifts and leverage our time and leverage the opportunity that we have within the window of that opportunity to change eternity for people in this community. That's what God's called us to do. I don't want someone else to fulfill the call that God has given us. Number 3, the most significant things in life often come with great risk. The most significant things in life often come with the greatest risk. Look at verse 16 of Esther chapter 4. This is Esther talking. She says, go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther would have to approach the king without permission. She would have to walk into the king's presence and trust that he was going to extend grace. And he could have been drunk. He could have been hung over. She had no idea his emotional or physical state of being. And she just says, if I perish, I perish. I love the uncertainty of this moment. This isn't a Joshua moment where God says, be strong and courageous, for I'll be with you. This isn't a Moses moment where God says, hey, I will be with you and I will speak for you. This isn't a Noah moment where God promises his presence. He's going to use Noah to save the world, right? This isn't an Abraham moment where God says, hey, I promise that you're going to be the father of many nations and I will be with you. Esther has no assurances that we know of that God is even going to show up. And she says, okay, if I die, I die. But it's all I got. I got one shot at this, and if it ends in death, it ends in death, but I'm going to go for it. And the truth is that God rarely provides before we say yes. God always provides after we say yes. Now, I'm not sure our faith is growing if it's not counterintuitive at times. Like it won't feel right at times. It won't feel like it makes sense at times. There are times in your life that God's will is going to make perfect sense, and it's going to be picture perfect, and everything's going to line up, and everything's going to work out, and you're going to say, oh my gosh, God just showed up in amazing ways. There's going to be times that it's uncertain, and the center of God's will not be the center of your comfort. It'll be at the edge of risk. Maybe the dating life you're looking for isn't found by lowering your standards. Maybe the dating life you're actually looking for is found by raising your standards. Maybe the life of purpose and meaning and significance that you're looking for isn't found by pursuing a promotion. Maybe it's found by enabling the people that work for you to be better. Maybe the life of financial freedom that you're looking for isn't found by making more money. Maybe it's found by being more generous. Maybe the marriage that you desire comes through vulnerability and honesty and not self-protection and defensiveness. Right? Maybe the faith that we're trying to experience isn't necessarily what always feels good. Maybe there's a counterintuitive aspect of it. There's this sweet statement of surrender. If I perish, I perish. It's trust and obedience regardless of the outcome. She wasn't in charge of the outcome. She was only in charge of her response to it, to the situation. God was in charge of the outcome. Lastly, as we close, there's more at stake than just your faithfulness. Look at how the story ends in Esther chapter 8, verse 17. It says, in every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness amongst the Jews with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. In other words, King Xerxes not only spared the Jewish people, he embraced them. And it was such a radical move for a Persian king to embrace the Jewish people that other people wanted to be Jewish. Esther saved a nation. Her obedience saved God's people from destruction. And can I just say, you have no idea what your yes to God, what's hanging in the balance there? What the impact of your obedience and your faithfulness can have on others? You have no idea how your choice to honor God at work is going to affect your coworkers. You have no idea how your choice to fight for your marriage is going to affect your kids. You have no idea how your choice to be generous is going to affect people in this community, in this church. That's why I'm so grateful for the generosity of the people here. I get all the emails. I get emails from people who said, I was given church my last shot. And then I came to Hope City. Do you know why that's possible? It's because